At the time, it shocked the world. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced that Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal, one of the most important trade routes on the planet. For nearly a century, the canal had been controlled by British and French interests, and suddenly that control was gone. Just a few months later, Britain and France launched a military intervention, together with Israel, hoping to regain control of the canal. Now here is where the story became unexpected. By 1956, the NATO alliance already existed. The United States, Britain, and France were supposed to be on the same side, part of the Western Bloc during the Cold War. So you might expect Washington to support its closest allies, but that is not what happened. Instead, the United States strongly opposed the invasion. In fact, Washington ended up pressuring Britain and France to withdraw, and in a strange twist of Cold War politics, the United States and the Soviet Union both pushed in the same direction, forcing the European powers to back down. The Suez Crisis became one of the first major moments when the United States and its European allies found themselves on opposite sides of a global conflict, and it was far from the last time. Throughout the last century, Europe and the United States have repeatedly clashed over wars, energy, technology, and global politics. Here are 3 times when the United States and Europe strongly disagreed. Let's continue with the Suez Crisis. When Britain and France launched their intervention in Egypt in late October 1956, the operation initially seemed military successful. Israeli forces moved quickly across the Sinai Peninsula, while British and French airstrikes targeted Egyptian airfields. Soon after, paratroopers and naval forces began moving towards the Suez Canal. But while the operation was unfolding on the ground, a political crisis was building in Washington. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious that the invasion had been planned without consulting the United States. At the height of the Cold War, the White House feared that a Western attack on Egypt could destabilize the entire Middle East and push newly independent countries towards the Soviet Union. There was also another concern. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, many countries had only recently gained independence from European colonial powers. If the United States openly supported Britain and France, it could make Washington appear to be defending old colonial empires, something Eisenhower believed would damage American influence around the world. So instead of backing its allies, the United States did the opposite. Washington went to the United Nations and demanded an immediate ceasefire. At the same time, American diplomats began applying intense pressure on London and Paris to stop the invasion. But the strongest pressure came through economics. At the time, Britain's financial system was already under strain, and the British government depended heavily on international confidence in the pound. The United States made clear that if Britain continued the operation, Washington could refuse to support the pound and block emergency financial assistance. For the British government, this was a serious threat. Without American financial backing, the British economy could face a major crisis. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union also condemned the invasion and issued its own warnings to Britain and France. Facing mounting diplomatic pressure, economic risks, and growing international criticism, Britain and France had little choice but to back down. Within weeks, their forces began withdrawing from Egypt. The outcome was humiliating for the European powers. Militarily, they had achieved many of their objectives. Politically, however, they had been forced to stop by their own ally. The Suez Crisis sent a clear message about the new balance of power in the Western Alliance. Britain and France were still important partners of the United States, but from that moment on, it was clear that major international actions would be far harder to carry out without Washington's approval. Another moment of tension came from France in the 1960s. At the time, NATO had already become the central military alliance of the Western world. With the United States playing the dominant role, thousands of American troops were stationed across Europe, and much of the alliance military planning was coordinated through NATO's integrated command structure. But French President Charles de Gaulle was deeply skeptical of this arrangement. He believed that France, and Europe more broadly, should not rely too heavily on American leadership for its security. De Gaulle wanted France to maintain full control over its own military forces and strategic decisions. So, in 1966, he made a bold move. France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command and demanded that all NATO headquarters and foreign troops leave French territory. The decision forced NATO to relocate its headquarters from Paris to Brussels, and thousands of American personnel had to move their bases out of France. France remained a member of NATO, but the message was clear. Even among close allies, there was limit to American influence. Tensions between the United States and Europe appeared again in the early 1980s, this time over energy. At the height of the Cold War, several Western European countries began supporting the construction of a massive natural gas pipeline from the Soviet Union to Western Europe. The project, known as Trans-Siberian pipeline, would transport Siberian gas across thousands of kilometers into European markets. For many European governments, this project made economic sense. The pipeline promised a stable supply of relatively cheap energy for growing industrial economies. But Washington saw the situation very differently. The administration of President Ronald Reagan feared that the pipeline would make Western Europe dangerously dependent on Soviet energy. At the same time, the Soviet Union would gain billions of dollars in hard currency, money that could potentially strengthen its economy and military. In 1982, the United States tried to stop the project. Washington imposed sanctions on companies involved in building the pipeline, including several European firms that were supplying equipment and technology. This created a serious dispute between the United States and its allies. European governments strongly opposed the sanctions, arguing that their energy policy should not be dictated from Washington. Despite American pressure, construction continued. The pipeline was eventually completed, and Soviet gas began flowing to Western Europe, highlighting once again that even during the Cold War, the United States and Europe did not always see global strategy the same way. Those were just a few moments when the United States and Europe found themselves on different sides of major global decisions. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more stories like this, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the channel grow and gives me the motivation to keep making new videos. Thanks for watching.